Hello, my name is Ronan Kernan. I'm your host today, and you are all very much welcome. Sit back, relax. This is going to be a lovely little discussion on heroes and how heroes function throughout history. So, today we're really going to start with classical mythology, gods, Troy, Achilles, the Argonauts, my personal favourite. I love the Argonauts. And then we're going to move on to talk about the medieval period. We're going to talk about Beowulf. We're going to talk about King Arthur, Joan of Arc. And again, we're going to talk about how even throughout the entirety of history, very much classical mythology keeps cropping up. It's everywhere. And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the modern era and what that means and how that's changed. We're also going to talk about what's stayed the same. There are very certain constants that have stayed the same throughout heroism in history. So first of all, I'm going to start with a lovely little overview of the three periods, because obviously not everyone knows everything about the period, including myself. I do not know everything. So when I talk about classical periods, I'm talking about ancient Rome and ancient Greece. The two of them are very, very similar in that the Romans very much adopted the ancient Greek Parthenon of gods, and they adopted their heroes and their legends. So these heroes, they were used as teaching tools mostly. They showed the Greek citizens and Roman citizens how to conduct business, how to conduct their religious life, what to do and what not to do in terms of fidelity, in terms of keeping promises, in terms of honor and duty. And duty is a very important aspect. You see it throughout a lot of ancient Greek and ancient Roman culture, because it's seen as duty to the state, duty to your family. Stoicism comes from Roman state and Roman Senate. So you usually get heroes like Achilles, who famously was dipped into the river of Styx by his mother, held by his ankle, which means he could not die unless he was shot in the ankle, which famously, if you've ever seen the film Troy, they do it in that, although it's not exactly accurate to to the actual legend. He gets shot by Paris in the ankle during the sack of Troy, which is famously done by the Trojan horse. After that, I mean, you have the Hercules is a very famous one. You have Oedipus Rex, where the famous term an Oedipus complex comes from. You have Jason and the Argonauts searching for the Golden Fleece, which is a personal favorite of mine. You even have Romulus and Remus, who founded Rome. Also, the Romans harken back to Troy. They use Aeneas as another founding of Troy. Not a founding of Troy, founding of Rome. My bad. He fled Troy and founded Rome in Italy. When we get into the medieval period, another overview, it changes again. Christianity gets introduced, and while heroes and legends are still used to teach people, it's less about. It's still about social norms. There's an added feature where it starts become history. It starts being legends, and it becomes history, and it's used to strengthen claims, and it's used to increase credibility of what kings are saying, what priests are saying, clergymen are saying, and it helps to enforce the role of God in life. God gets introduced all over the place. You see it in Beowulf, the famous villain in that. Grendel is a son of Cain. We only have one transcript of this, written in long before its origins, we assume. And Grendel is the son of Cain. So is Grendel's mother. Would be a daughter of Cain, I assume. And for those of you who don't know, Cain and Abel, Cain is the man who murders his own brother Abel out of jealousy. And God marked him with this indistinguishable mark and banished him. Anne Rice famously made him the first vampire, and he's been used quite a bit as a stem of evil. So in medieval heroes, they're pious. Most of the time, you have Joan of Arc, King Arthur, Charlemagne. You have these people are trying to harken back to these olden times. You often see these genealogies that at the start bring back to the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor, this is closer to the fall of Rome, when people are trying to establish themselves as strong individuals, and they decide to harken themselves back to the founding of their state, or the founding of their line, back to this emperor who was the first Christian emperor. You see it being done in King Arthur. It changes. It takes a more mythological approach in King Arthur, where the founding of England is sent back to Aeneas again, the man who apparently founded Rome, except it's his great grandson. So that sort of religious connotation really kind of flows through a lot of classical and medieval mythology and heroes, in that it changes from the polytheistic Greek-Roman Parthenon with Zeus and Hera and Athena and Jupiter and Mars, and it changes into the Christian Catholic single God looking down on these people. And it changes again in that a lot of the heroes you see in medieval legends, we can kind of assume they existed. The same thing happened in classical literature. You have things like Alexander the Great, who was very much alive. He died at 30, but I mean, there are tales told of him that are exaggerated. Stuff like that. Some of them aren't exaggerated, which is fine, obviously. But at this period, mythology and history blur. There isn't a big separation between these two periods until you get to the modern period, which I'm counting the modern period as just after the Renaissance. It's the printing press has been invented. People are more widely educated, and there's a bigger want to learn, and people's curiosity is getting deeper, and they want to know more about what's actually going on in the world. And I think the printing press and the availability of massively produced books and learning is key for the change in a hero, because they no longer became teaching tools, in that they started becoming entertainment. So what you see a reproduction of these old classical tales, like the Argonauts and like Achilles and like Alexander the Great, but they're not being told for educational purposes. They're being told for entertainment. People read them because they like the stories, and that sort of attitude changes how heroes are seen. They're still used as a teaching tool, but not for practical daily life, such as they are in ancient mythology, and not longer to teach morality as a daily thought process, something you should think about every day. Heroes start becoming an ideal that people should strive to be like, but not exactly like. It's something that changes throughout his history. The attainability of this heroic status changes, in that when you get to like the invention of Superman and you get to the invention of Batman in the late 30s, no one's going to be Superman. No matter how much we want to be Superman, no matter how much he's the ideal, he's a pillar that people can flock around. He's a figure that we can use, and he's a figure that we can enjoy and strive to be like, but not be him. And it's different in that he becomes a moral ideal, and he becomes the perfect person. He's the extreme on one end, and then what you get on the other end is the villains. You get the extreme on the other end. So if you look at the Batman and the Joker, the Batman is order. He's disciplined. He does his duty, and that's it. And he sacrifices his personal happiness for the good of others. But then when you look at the Joker, he's the opposite. He's impulsive. He's chaotic. He does what he wants to do, and he doesn't care about what everyone else wants to do. He just happens to enjoy psychosis, so he does it, which is different to Batman, who is ordered. He does what he has to do, not what he wants to do. Whereas if you look at older heroes, if you look at Achilles, he was arrogant. He was impulsive. He was aggressive, but his job wasn't to be a moral perfect. His job was to teach you certain aspects of culture and how to act in the world. You look at the Argonauts, and one of the first things it teaches you is to be respectful and careful of your elders, because very early in the story, Jason is on his way to a city, and he meets this old elderly woman who wants to cross a river, and she's too elderly to do it. And so what Jason does is he helps her across the river, and later we learn that that woman was the goddess Hera in disguise. Now, because Jason passed the test, all these myths are filled with the gods testing these heroes to see if they're worthy. Because Jason passes his test, he's favored by the goddess Hera, which, if you look at Greek and Roman myth, is a hard thing to do. It's hard to get the favor of Hera. She is the wife of Zeus, who is a notorious cheater. Half the heroes in Greek myth are the bastard sons of Zeus, who makes them in a variety of different animal forms, such as swans and bulls, which I don't understand why. I feel like it's a personal preference of the authors. Anyway, I only speculate. I can't say for certain. I'm not from ancient Greece. So, with this favor, there are very certain aspects of the journey that Jason and the Argonauts take that he wouldn't have been able to complete without the help of Hera. One such being, they're on the sea, and they hit an impassable wall of rocks that the ship will scupper against and sink. But Hera, she invokes her godly power and asks the assistance of the goddess Neptune to send his daughters to guide the Argonauts safely through this perilous pass. So again, this teaches the people reading the story that you should help others, and you should always strive. It's famous. You should always strive to help those in need, because you don't know, they might be a god or goddess in disguise. It also explains why the Trojans accepted the Trojan horse. The Greeks were notoriously hesitant to not accept any gifts, because the gods had a tendency to give you a gift and then be offended when you didn't take it. So when the Trojans saw the giant Trojan horse, they maybe thought it was a gift from the gods, and they felt that they should accept it in case they invoke the wrath of whatever god gifted it to them. Because you can see this in the Argonautica. The Argonauts arrive on an island which is with just women, and you wonder why, and they tell you. At one point, the men on the island, who were famously cheating all over the place, once said that their wives and women were prettier than the Athena. And so what happened is, this is why these men cheated, because she cursed them so that they would never be faithful to their wives. And so what happened is, the wives decided the best thing to do is kill all the men, and they took the king and they set him off on a raft out into the open sea, because they couldn't kill him. I don't know, for some reason. So the Argonauts arrive, and it's all just women, and it's a perfect example of how fickle the gods are. They're favoring Jason and his band of heroes, and they condemn these other men for something that's quite small, which the whole thing is just a tale to watch what you do with the gods. And back then, because these gods were real, so people would read this and they were like, oh geez, I should really make sure I worship Athena right, or I should really make sure that Hera doesn't curse me because I'm not helping people, or I have to keep my oaths because Zeus will strike me down if I don't. And as I was saying, that now that's changed. We don't look at Superman and we read the story and we don't learn something that we should do from the story. What we do learn are aspects, and we learn philosophical ideas that we can use in our daily lives that don't affect our actions. I mean, they affect our actions in that we have a way of thinking, and then like we should help those who need help. We should that rings through, but it's not as blatant. It's not. Superman helps people not because it might be a god or goddess in disguise. He helps people because he believes that's the right thing to do. This idea of morality kind of comes in where he's doing it on his own volition. No one's making him do this, which is something that you don't see in the classical myth. In medieval literature, that changes again. It's pious. It's piety. People do things because either God told them to do that, or they believe that it will help them with God. You see them purging the wicked or spreading the word of God. You can look at a lot of saints in the same way you can look at heroes, in that saints all have a martyrdom, so they died doing for God, and because they died for God, they live on. You can look at Joan of Arc for that. She famously died being burned for witchcraft by the English. Now, she did exist. Joan of Arc was a real woman. She did lead forces for the French in the 100 Years' War, and she claimed she was hearing voices from God. Now, today, in the modern period, looking back, you could say it was schizophrenia, in that she was hearing voices. She thought they were the voices of God. It was a mental disease. So, this story was told as she died. She was a noble sacrifice. The fact that she died doesn't mean she failed. It just means that she died for God, and that's okay. Now, this idea of death, a lot of medieval literature has people dying. I mean, it was expected for heroes to die at the end of the story. Beowulf dies. He dies to a dragon. King Arthur dies. Joan of Arc dies. If you look at my own country, the Irish mythology can be quite interesting because it doesn't harken back to the Roman era because they never came here. It still looks at the religious aspect, but they all die in the end as well. If you look at Uiscin and Tir na Nog, he leaves the Fianna, which is a group of heroes, for those of you who don't know Irish myth. The beauty Niamh, with locks of golden hair, arrives to him on a white stallion and tells him, I want to marry you, I want to bring you to my home, Tir na Nog, which is the country of youth, the kingdom of youth. And some stories say she put a spell on Uiscin, some don't. So he accepts, and he gets on the horse and he rides away with her, and they go on a journey, but he leaves behind his Fianna. And so what they do is they ride away and they arrive to the country of the youth, Tir na Nog, and they marry and they have children, and he lives for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then what he does is he starts to feel a sense of loss because he wants to see his old friends and his father and his family back home in Ireland again. So Niamh gives him the white stallion, and she tells him 3 times, as a story trope, that you should never fall off the horse. And so what happens is he arrives back in Ireland, and he, being a hero, he sees that everything's changed. He doesn't realize how long he's been away and everything's changed, but see these 2 men trying to lift a boulder, and him, being a great hero, lifts a boulder with one hand. But in the process, he falls off the horse and he ages again. He ages all the years that he lost in Tir na Nog, and then he dies. So, I mean, this idea of dying at the end of a story, it is present throughout all of these older myths and heroes. The idea of a hero living through the tale is a relatively new concept. So, I mean, there's one thing you could say is that it's not that the story ended with their death, it just the story kept going until they died, which I think is a good case for the tale of Oedipus, who was king of Thebes. He famously married his mother and had kids with her, which is a misconception. He didn't know it was his mother, and when he does find out it's his mother, he tries to murder her. It turns out she's already dead. She killed herself when she discovers that Oedipus finds out the truth. But, I mean, you could very much end the story with that revelation, but the story doesn't end. It keeps going. His sons he banishes himself and makes his sons the kings of Thebes, but he curses them first. Greek myth is full of all this scandal in that if they were ever to fight each other on the battlefield, both of them would die. So he leaves, his sons eventually die, his daughters die, and then he dies. But there are many. You could have ended the story of Oedipus at his banishment, at the revelation that he married his mother. When he became king of Thebes, you could have ended the story there. So you can say that these stories just kept going until the character died. I mean, either there's no other way to get rid of them, or there's no way to save them from what they were doing. They had to die. There's no realistic way for them to get out of the thing. That was the predicament that they were in. So I mean that idea of death keeps cropping up. But I mean, again, it crops up in modern heroes too. I mean, Superman has died, Batman has died. I mean, look, if they just have a tendency to come back. Look at Jason Todd as Robin comes back as Red Hood. You can look at Superman dies and he gets resurrected. If a character dies, sometimes their mantle is just passed to another person. That happens with Spider-Man. Peter Parker dies and he passes his mantle on to another person. If in the X-Men people die, the fact that the X-Men is a team means that you can just replace those who die in it. That sense of continuity still remains. But the fact of the matter is that the hero wins in the end. The story ends at their victory. It doesn't continue on. We can just assume what happens after their victory, which isn't the case in older mythologies at all. We continue learning about them after their victories. You can look at Hercules is a good example. We follow him through his trials, but then we follow him further on. Another difference between modern ones and today is the idea of revenge. I find in medieval literature, revenge is something you can do. It's something heroes do very often. They avenge people, and they kill them. They kill the person who killed their family, or they kill the person who killed their loved ones or their brothers, or took their throne or their crown. It happens very regularly. If you look in Beowulf shows us very interesting aspects of the culture at the time, in that the king offers Beowulf compensation for the death of one of his sword brothers. In that, it shows us that it was very common practice for there to be some sort of monetary compensation for this sort of loss, in that because Grendel had murdered one of Beowulf's brothers in arms in Herd Hall, meant that the king could compensate Beowulf for the loss. And then it mentions again that another one is murdered by Grendel's mother, and a key point of that is that King Hrothgar says, I can't compensate you for this because she won't let me. You're going to have to kill her. It's very off the cuff. This sort of idea of revenge, it's in classical literature as well. Alexander the Great avenges people. Achilles does. Hercules does famously. Well, not famously, but his attendant, I think the best word to say, is ravished by sea nymphs on the quest for the Golden Fleece with the Argonauts, and he leaves the Argonauts to avenge this attendant. To kill these nymphs for killing his. Well, we don't know if he was killed. The term is ravished. I am unclear about what ravished means in this context. Could mean anything. So, this idea of revenge, you can see this idea of revenge change in our modern contemporary things, in that it becomes something bad. Not the journey of revenge. The journey of revenge stays the same. A lot of stories has the protagonist chasing down a villain for revenge. He's done something and he needs to pay for it. But very often you see at the end, the villain is forgiven by the hero. He doesn't actually enact his revenge. He doesn't avenge what happened to him. He forgives the villain for his acts, and he comes out better for it. I find it a key difference in heroism throughout history is this key change, and it happens. I wouldn't say suddenly, but it doesn't happen gradually either. If you look at all the other modern superheroes, very few of them actually avenge their the transgressions that have been put on them. So, and if they do, it ends badly for them. They either regret it or something worse happens because of the revenge. Either someone comes to take revenge on them, someone more powerful, or they regret their decision and they have to live with this murder that they've committed, even though they've murdered a lot of other people before and probably after their vengeance. So with that sort of revenge, we kind of come into what justice and the law is. For us, justice and law are very much tied together. We have the courts, we have police force. Law is there to enact justice. Whereas when you look back in history, it wasn't always the same. Justice and law were not always the same thing. People would fix injustices through murder, through revenge, and it was fine. It was a cultural norm in the society. The main point is they didn't have as established order as we do now. They didn't have these courts. They didn't have an established police force which enacted this order and this law. It was very much down to the individual to make sure that they got what they wanted and that their order and their justice was upheld. Well, I think that's the key difference in this difference in the revenge tale, is that we now have a third party to enact our justice for us, and that's what happens. You see this at the end of a lot of stories. The villain isn't killed, he's arrested. And he's branded a criminal, and he's brought to courts, and he's found guilty of his crimes. And so you see justice fulfilled in that order is maintained, there are no upsets, and due process is upheld. But when you look back in history, you don't have that court system. There are court systems, don't get me wrong, but they're usually upheld by the king and his court. There isn't a unified court system in the area, so it's very much up to the individual to make sure that they feel like due process has been upheld and that the transgression that they have has been, the transgression that they felt has been appeased. So, like in the likes of Beowulf, it was done through monetary compensation. If you look at Hercules, for those of you who don't know the 12 Trials of Hercules, he's the bastard son of Zeus. So Hera, being annoyed the fact that Zeus had gone off and had a baby with yet another woman, she curses Hercules to kill his family, and then to redeem himself for being a kin killer, he has to go through these 12 trials of Hercules, like these insurmountable mountains that he had to climb, these impossible tasks that he had to complete to redeem himself in the eyes of the gods. So there's a sort of self-justice implied here, and a sort of self-redemption, in that Hercules needs to redeem himself for his actions, because there isn't a court of law which he can go to which will judge him and arrest him like you see today. I mean, you can see people confessing from crimes that they committed because they feel guilty about them and they feel like they need to redeem themselves. So Zeus and Hera and the gods are seen as the judges of these heroes, but they don't hand out sentences in that people go to jail. They hand out sentences in that there are certain actions you need to complete to redeem yourself in the eyes of us and in the eyes of society as a whole. And now in the end, Hercules completes these tasks and he redeems himself. And that follows through into medieval literature, in that people need to find forgiveness with God. And with God, again, you're given these certain tasks. If you look at the Bible, if you look at the Old Testament, God looks at the world and he sees that it's filled with sin, so he floods it in the tale of Noah and his ark. And he tells Noah that he's to redeem, you're the one that I need to redeem humanity, so I'm going to tell you how to build the ark, and you bring your wife and you bring your children. and you bring two of every animal on earth, and that's the story of Noah's Ark. Those who don't know it. So again, there is no human court sitting there judging, saying, well, this is wrong and this is right. It's another otherworldly entity who is looking down on the earth and making arbitrary judgments. Which again is because when the Bible's written obviously around, I think it's 1080, something like that. Well, like height of the Roman Empire. But then when it was read in the medieval period, there again weren't many. God was seen as the final judge, and even in these courts made by kings, you had trials by combat and stuff, which were seen as God will pick the innocent man. So if you win, it's God helping you win, and you become the victor. You become the one favored by the Lord, and so you become the innocent man. This again, like I said, this changes because heroes become secular. Even the classical heroes become secular in that we don't believe in, the majority of people don't believe in the old Parthenonic Greek and Roman gods. So when the Greek and Roman gods help these heroes, we're not reading it as in these are our gods and they're helping us. We read it as in like these are these fictional otherworldly entities assisting these also fictional mortal heroes. So we rely more on the courts and on justice now, as we see it, in these modern heroes, rather than in revenge and in our own personal justice, like they did in the older classical heroes and medieval heroes. I mean, that brings me to the idea of gods and God in a heroic tale. That changes again as well, in that even to the point where the gods are no longer these third-party, disconnected figures who look down on the earth and arbitrarily judge people and act on them in a cold, very callous way. You can see Zeus very much has no time for oath breakers except for people who cheat, because that he does it all the time. Hera very much dislikes a lot of people. And then again, you see it in medieval history in that God, if in the Old Testament, God smites and kills people left, right, and center, and you see it with Joan of Arc. She dies, and like God doesn't save her. If she was chosen by God, he doesn't save her. He doesn't extinguish the flames. You don't see it with a lot of saints; they all die in the end. And you see it with King Arthur. God doesn't stop Lancelot from cheating, from taking Guinevere from him. So God's change in modern here, in that if you look at Marvel Comics, you have Thor. Thor is a god. He's a Norse god. He's up there. Odin, Loki, they're all Norse gods. Again, you have Zeus in comics as a superhero, which you can say means that we've created these other fictional gods, like in Superman, in Batman, in Green Lantern. We can see that they ascend from normal morality into a higher morality. But I wouldn't say. I would say that the heroes that we have today have just become secular in that they don't need gods to tell them what to do. They're their own powerful individuals, and they set their own morality and they set their own duty. And that's why we can see heroes like Thor and like Zeus and like Odin in these comics and in these movies, because the gods aren't present anymore. We don't see them as gods. We just see them as these other beings. Culturally, we don't see them as gods anymore, so we don't fear their wrath, which means that we can bring them to our level. Rather than us reaching for them, we're pulling them down further into us. And we give them flaws and we give them weaknesses, whereas in the older tales, they didn't have weaknesses and they didn't have flaws. They were perfect beings. I mean, Zeus, the king of gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, she was the wisest, and she was also the goddess of victory. Athena Nike was the goddess of victory. So these entities were perfect and they were untouchable, and no one could actually. The only person who could kill a god was a god, which you see in the origin tales. You see Cronus, who famously swallowed his children, and Zeus coming and saving them. But there are no mortal men involved in these tales. They're just the gods fighting the gods. And this means that they're above us. But once these things start becoming secular and we don't have these religious ties to these gods and to these heroes, they're no longer these morality teaching tools for religion. They get pulled down onto our level, and they gain weaknesses, and they gain humanity almost because A, it makes a better story, and B, we're not afraid to do it anymore. So, I mean, even if you see it in modern tales, in the last 10 years, there's like a secularization of established religions we have today, in that you can see it in, say, if you watch Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman, while in my opinion not great films, there's an interesting note in that there's a lot of Jesus symbology in Man of Steel, and debates about Superman as a god in the stories, which you wouldn't have really seen before back in history or 30 years ago. He was never equated to a deity figure until very recently. So with these superheroes, I guess that's the main point to make. These superheroes, they're no longer just heroes, they're superheroes. They very much have a villain nemesis counterpart, which is a relatively new idea that has come about, and it's another large difference between the two, between now and the past, in that many of the older stories involve journeys. It's these people taking journeys, and in these journeys they learn and they grow. But the antagonist is the antagonist isn't a figure, it's more a person. It's not more of a person, it's less of a person and a figure, and more of an obstacle that they must overcome. When you look at the Argonauts, it's, like I said before, these the impassable rocks, or it's the monster guarding the Golden Fleece. If you look at Hercules, it's the 12 trials. Those are the antagonists of the tale. Each one is a different trial, and each one is a different person, or a different monster, or a different objective that he must pass, and that's the antagonist. When you look at modern tales, you have the Joker versus Batman, and you have Superman versus Lex Luthor, and you have Spider-Man versus Dr. Octopus, and you have the X-Men versus racism, basically, or Magneto. So, I mean, it's an interesting difference in the two. I feel it's more because heroes become more idealistic, so they need their idealistic opposite. In that, like I said before, in the example of Batman being order, the Joker being chaos, to have one, you need the other for any sort of conflict to occur, and there's always conflict. That's obviously one of the constants between in all of history. There's always conflict in a hero tale. It's just good storytelling. You need conflict for a hero to grow and for a hero to develop. And the key difference is that in modern tales, that conflict stems from a single entity that the hero can focus their efforts on and focus their growth towards. And in older tales, if you look at Beowulf, it's different. Beowulf isn't there because of Grendel. Well, he is there because of Grendel, but Grendel isn't his nemesis. Grendel isn't his antagonist. Grendel is a antagonist that Beowulf fights, but Beowulf also goes on to fight Grendel's mother, and he also goes on to fight a dragon in this epic poem. And he doesn't arrive to King Hrothgar's aid because of Grendel. He arrives because of he's duty bound. And these heroes very much enjoy duty, they enjoy honor, and that's what they strive for. They strive for duty and honor. They don't strive for the good of man. They don't strive for better humanity. They're quite selfish in a way, in that a lot of their actions are done to improve their station, or to give them honor, or to fulfill their duty as a hero, which is different to modern day heroes, because they do things for their duty is to the betterment of mankind, and their duty is to protect mankind. and they protect mankind, and they protect this, and this duty stems from this other single entity. Now, it stems out again, but most heroes will have a main nemesis. I mean, Batman has Joker, obviously. He has Scarecrow, Bane, Catwoman, Poison Ivy. They're all antagonists that he has to fight, and sometimes they team up, sometimes they don't, but they're single entities that he has to fight. He doesn't have to overcome. There's obstacles that are put in his way, but we know who put them there. These villains put them there. Whereas in these older tales, these obstacles aren't put there by a specific person. They're just there, and the hero has to overcome them. And these sort of ideas, it kind of makes it seem like it shows where the focus was in these tales, in these older tales, in that they aren't there for us to see a conflict between two people. They're there for us to watch this figure, this symbol of a certain ideal or aspect of life that people have to uphold, and we watch it being challenged, and we watched how this ideal being challenged overcomes it, and that's how we should use that in our own lives, which is what these old tales were used. A lot of the medieval tales, piety sees through. In Joan of Arc, she uses the power of God, and she uses the voices of God. It was God, because she was favored by God, she was so good on the battlefield. If you look at Beowulf, while he isn't led by God, he's led by duty, and he's led by honor, and he's led by his need to further his station and his duty to his king. He's a Geat. He travels to the aid of King Hrothgar to assist him, and then he travels back, and rather than keeping his spoils, his rewards from Hrothgar, he instead gives them to his king, who then in turn thanks Beowulf, and Beowulf after that becomes king himself. These ideas of a single nemesis are new, and I feel it's because we're no longer looking at these heroes as teaching tools. Instead, what we want now out of heroes is to see one extreme against another extreme, and we'll see what happens. I mean, you see it in Batman, you see it in Spider-Man, you see it in Superman, and the idea is that these ultimate goods will always win over these ultimate evils, but they won't ever annihilate these ultimate evils, because it's such a key. The value of human life is such a key element of these heroic figures that even though they defeat evil, they won't ever squash it. I think so. I mean, what you can say is if they kill the villain, they can't bring the villain back. As a cynical, secular, business-like mindset, that they don't kill off these villains because they would have to write new ones if they keep killing off the villains. Which is true. I mean, I will agree with that, but I feel like if you look at it in a symbolic, philosophical, moral aspect, it's very much the idea of good versus evil, whereas in older heroes, that idea, it's not good versus evil, it's a certain ideal against adversity, and most of the time it wins out. In the end, a lot of the times it doesn't win out. The hero is defeated and he dies, such as the case is Beowulf versus the dragon. But he doesn't die because he fails where he does fail. It's not because of that. His death is a way to highlight the importance of brotherhood and duty, in that only one other of his shield brothers follows him in to fight the dragon. The others stay behind because they're afraid, and then Beowulf dies because he didn't have the support of his warband. So again, I think that's another idea, in that these heroes were there to show aspects of real life, whereas these modern day heroes, they don't have aspects of real life. They're moral ideals that we strive to reach. They're the ideal world. I mean, if you look at X-Men, you can see the adversity between mutants and normal people, and that the normal people want to get rid of the mutants, but the mutants still hold on. They still fight strong, and they want equality. And it's very much like parallels with racism throughout the world, with different ethnicities and minorities in the world. And again, it's a moral ideal. It's this minority group that we see are like seen as a moral ideal in that they encompass all the other minorities fighting in the real life. Again, real life minorities do not have superpowers. They don't. If they do, I'd like to meet one. But the fact that they have superpowers isn't the point. They just have these superpowers as for entertainment almost, in that these superpowers are their way to fight these beings, and we enjoy these stories because of this fantastic otherworldly idea that they have. But their struggle is something that we can relate to as well, and that's something that's very important for the difference in old and new tales, is this difference in that these heroes aren't aspects of things that we can do. They're beacons of hope for certain people, in that they can take lessons and ideas from these big, large, powerful entities and translate them into their own life and use them in a more realistic sense. In that, of course, racism should be fought. It should be squashed out, and it should be eradicated wherever it can be. Not with adamantium claws and telekinesis, but with thought, reason, debate, and change. Through protest, through legislation, through cultural teachings, anything like that. When you take away the superpowers these modern superheroes, what they become is not a lesson, but an image of an ideal world where good wins out all the time. If you take away the superpowers of Superman and you take away the technological advance of Lex Luthor and you put them together and you look at the stories, Superman will win because it's an ideal world, and in an ideal world, the good will always win. And that's, I think, a main difference between the two, old and new, is that the old stories aren't there to give you an ideal world. The old heroes are there to show you how to live in the world you're in at the moment, whereas these new superheroes are there to show you what an ideal world can look like and something that you can hope to achieve, hope you can make the world reach, rather than just using them as teaching tools to live in the world you live in now and explain atrocities and explain bad things that happen through either the gods or something like that. So we're going to tie it up. I think we'll tie it up with a few little of the I'll just talk about a few of the similarities you see, because there are a few. I mean, one thing you see is in classical mythology, heroes gain their powers either through birthright, either they're demigods, they're sons and daughters of gods, or they earn weapons through family or otherwise. And you see the same thing in superheroes. You see it in the Green Lantern with the rings. You see it. Superman is powerful because of his lineage. His powers come from the fact that he's an alien. Batman makes everything because of his parents' fortune. Thor, again, you see, look at Thor in Marvel. He gains his power because of who he is, and you can look at Quasar and that same thing. She gains her powers because she inherits them, and you can look at the X-Men. They gain their powers because of what they are and who they are. It's something they earn them through family or heritage. It's something that's the same to all of them. And the same thing as parentage is important. You can see parentage throughout everything. Batman, I mean, you can say Batman's parentage is important because their death promotes him to become a superhero. Superman's parents, because they're aliens, his parentage, his lineage allows him to be able to fly and be able to shoot lasers out of his eye and be bulletproof. That's what that is. And it's a very important constant, because I guess it kind of shows that it puts an importance on where you come from. It's always been there. Where you come from has always been a very important part of people's lives, both in comics, in books, in novels, in real life. Everyone likes to know where they're from, and everyone likes to know their family history as a sense of community and as a sense of belonging, and it rings through in Heroes as well. Another thing that is very, very constant between both is redemption. Redemption is in almost all hero tales. At some point, something needs to be redeemed. Honor needs to be redeemed, or order needs to be restored, or they need to redeem their past actions, and that's something that is always present throughout all heroes. And there's always a journey. There's always conflict, like I said before, and heroes have always represented something. They're never just a hero for hero's sake. They're a hero because of something. And while what they're representing changes, like I said before, it changes from being an aspect of real life, which teaches people how to live and how to practice, and it changes into more moral ideals and a moral ideal world. All these heroes still represent something, and it's very important, because with these representations, what happens is in all hero tales they fight insurmountable odds. They fight against the norm. They do the impossible. Hercules completes his trials. The Argonauts get the Golden Fleece. Superman beats Lex Luthor and all the other villains. Superman beats General Zod, even though General Zod's a mighty warrior. And Batman manages to stop the Joker and time again, even though it seems like he's about to die. He pulls something out and he wins. And it's important because what these insurmountable odds do is they show that people and their ideals, and these ideals of good and these ideals of morality and these ideas of doing the right thing. It represents that in the end they will win out. A lot of villains represent selfishness, and they do things for themselves, and in the modern times anyway, heroes tend to be selfless. They do things for others. They very rarely do things for themselves, putting themselves in danger for the betterment of others. And they win out because they do this, because they help other people. Those people help them in turn, and in the end they win out because they have the assistance of and gratitude of other people. So these insurmountable odds are really, really important in all tales, because they allow the author and they allow the reader to see these heroes, these people that they're rooting for, and the idea, and the people that they agree with the ideas that they represent, and they can see that no matter what, they will win. And those opposite ideals, these negative ideals that that these villains represent, and these obstacles represent, and these antagonists represent, get defeated in the end. In that, even if they're more powerful, and even if they gain more power, you can look at Star Wars. It's a great idea. You have the Jedi and you have the Sith, and they're both opposite ends, and it's always about like, oh, the Sith are selfish, and the Sith are they are all out for themselves, and they believe in power, and power is what they want, and they're more powerful than the Jedi, and the Jedi don't have the same power in the Force as these Sith do, but they still win out because they stand for order, and they stand for the ideal good, and they work together, and they believe in cooperation. And the Sith don't. The Sith kill each other left, right, and center, and they take part in political intrigue and espionage, and they backstab each other for more power and and better positions. So the Jedi still win, even though these Sith are more powerful, because it makes it easy. It makes it, their ideals make them more powerful in the long run, because they have these ideals of discipline and cooperation and friendship, whereas the other ones don't. And you can look in that in a sense of, no community works without cooperation. So people needed to be taught that if you work with your fellow man, you'll come out on top. Because it is tempting to take everything for yourself, hoard things, and make sure you're good, and take things at the expense of others to make sure that you're better because you want to be happy. It's a natural thing. People want to make themselves happy, and people want to be happy in themselves, and they want to be comfortable. So with all these morality tales and with all these heroes, it shows us that yes, in the short term you will be happy, and in the short term you will be better, but in the long term you should always help others. And it was an important thing to teach when people were establishing communities first, and when people were learning to work with each other. And now it still follows through now today, because we have a social norm in that I'm not going to go and stab someone in the street randomly because of law and order, and because of community, and because of I believe in the rights of fellow people. So we enjoy these stories, these new stories, these superheroes, and these fighting these villains, because it's our social norms and our ideals fighting against these outlying ideals that can be present in our normal society, and we see them getting defeated, which is something we like. We like to watch these things getting defeated, and that's why even if they're more powerful, and that's why all these stories, in my opinion, contain these insurmountable odds. So at that insurmountable odds point, I'm going to leave you now. I really hope you all enjoyed listening. I could tell you what my next podcast will be on, but I frankly don't know yet. So keep an eye out. I really hope you all enjoyed. I enjoyed speaking about it. It's a personal. It's something I'm personally very interested in. So I very, very much enjoyed talking today. I really hope you enjoyed listening to me, and I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon, morning, night, whenever you were listening to this, and all the best, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.